Welcome to the summit, What is Wholeness Here and Now? And now I have Miranda Macpherson here. Hi, Miranda.
Hi, Susan. Good to meet you and be with you.
Yeah, thank you and welcome. And I know you from a conference I went to. I saw you there, and you were doing like a satsang and singing as well. So I remember you from that. Actually, you made me cry. I was crying about the surrender. I was like, oh, and anyway, and then I read your book, The Way of Grace, the transformation power of ego relaxation, and you have your book right there, right? Because I have the audio book, which is beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
but you
Yeah.
have the actual book right there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And you've also written some other books, and then you founded the One Spirit Interfaith Foundation in London, where you've educated about 600 ministers,
Mm-hmm.
and now you have the Living Grace Sangha in Northern California. So yeah, thank you for doing all your work and
Yeah.
spreading your beautiful message that I'm gonna ask a few questions about. So, and it's we could start with grace,
Mm-hmm.
because I do love the word grace. And what do you mean by grace?
I mean the living presence of the divine, really, the direct experience of divine presence. When it comes online from within us, we feel blessed. We feel our unity. We feel all that connectedness with the essential qualities of our true nature, and we know what and who we really are. And so that is an experience of grace, and it is transformative, revelatory, nourishing, meaningful. It puts us back in touch with who and what we really are and why we're all here.
Yeah, and is it kind of like a space, like grace? It sounds like space grace. Oh, maybe that's why I think of space grace, right?
Well, maybe, yeah. Well, I think that part of what I write about in my book is that grace has four primary ways that it manifests or comes alive in our experience. And that each, what I call dimension of grace, has a particular way of helping us to walk the spiritual path and to be who we really are in this world. And so I start with the fact that grace is at the deepest level, looking at it from a non dual perspective. Grace is the foundation of everything. If you consider like what causes everything to exist in the way that it does, what causes your heart to beat, what causes you to be interested to walk a spiritual path, what causes all of nature to unfold as it does, what is it that's animating everything? We see that there is this mysterious, loving intelligence that is, it's not an it, a something or a somebody. It's not owned by any tradition or religion, but it is grace ultimately that is the ground of everything. And so that grace emerges out of emptiness or spaciousness or void. And so, yes, there's a relationship between the emptiness and the fullness of grace. But the grace is also it's a nourishment too. So I call that the dimension of grace. It's about the blessings. And so when we feel that grace coming alive, it also has a personal quality. And many of us have experienced that, perhaps, as if feeling shepherded from harm. Maybe, you almost had an accident on the freeway, and often we say, there but for the grace go I, and we realize somehow we were shepherded from harm, but we know not quite who or how, but we feel that. Or we're brought together towards someone really important. We just fall in love with someone, and as if something knows who and what we need more than we do. Or perhaps we experience that grace as synchronicity that brings us into the felt sense of being loved and cared for, being nourished. So that's what I call the blessings of grace. And when we consider also the moments of revelation and transformation, deep shifts in our consciousness, the kind that we all want, that move us into freedom and wholeness and our truth, then we see that it's a mystery between our sincere effort, willingness, engagement with spiritual truth and practice, but that ultimately what transforms us is grace itself. We don't make transformation happen, but we open to the grace that transforms us from one dimension of consciousness to another, that transforms our suffering into wisdom. And ultimately, grace is a way, which is why I titled the book, The Way of Grace. Grace is a way of walking through this world, in this world, but not of this world, being and becoming a more graceful human being, becoming and embodying your deepest nature, all of the virtues and the qualities of your deepest nature in each moment of life. And of course, that's an ongoing process. And the good news is there's grace to help us along the way, every step of the way.
Yeah. So you mentioned the ego relaxation. So when you relax the ego, then you're swimming in grace, or
Yeah, well, in a way, ego relaxation is the how grace comes alive. Many great spiritual traditions, when you really study them, and I have, they really, what it boils down to is surrender, right? Getting out of the way, letting go of the limitations and the obscurations of the mind that belong to a separate somebody that thinks they are the doer. So we could call that ego, right? And every one of us has an ego structure that is patterned by the past, shaped by our experiences and our interpretations of our experience, shaped by our cultural experience, and shaped by, so many things. And so, of course, all spiritual work is helping us to move beyond the limitations of ego. But it's really all about the methodology. So many spiritual methods, or I think it would be more accurate to say a trap of spiritual enlightenment or awakening, is to think we have to eradicate the ego. And I don't think that's very possible. I haven't seen it actually work. And so I think that part of what I see a lot of people falling into is either just trying to jump over their ego structure, or transcend it, or deny it, or repress it, or talk a good game. And I think part of what's led to that is the fact that spiritual teachings up until very, very recently have only been given through the masculine lens. That's tended to take this sort of view of ego annihilation, or just ego transcendence. And I think that that's missing an important part of the understanding, which is that ego represents our suffering. It represents our disconnection. It represents our fear, our loss, our ignorance, our misunderstanding, our wounds, and suffering. And all of that really is suffering. It's not going to get addressed by anything other than love. So ego relaxation is the method that opens up true surrender. You don't do surrender. There's no one to surrender. There's just the work of bringing the places where we're caught, or hard, or defended, or bound in something, to the light of awareness, and contacting it with loving presence, loving awareness, and then letting it relax. So it's really about learning to be present, see everything, feel everything, and do nothing to change, fix, transcend, or get around it. That's what ego relaxation really is. And it actually creates space. It allows for softening to happen of the density of ego. In the same way that if you have a great big hard block of ice, if we liken ego to that big hard block of ice, all spiritual traditions agree that we need to somehow find a way of transforming that opaque, dense hardness of our consciousness back into the fluid, clear transparency of its origin. So we don't need to hack away at that block of ice, at our ego, like with an ice pack. We don't need to aggress upon ourselves in the name of spiritual awakening. Instead, just like the warmth of the sun will touch that hard block of ice and just start melting it, so bringing love, bringing awareness, bringing just presence to those places where we are caught, bound, confused, attached, positional, defended, and doing absolutely nothing, just being there, allows that melting to happen. And that's what allows grace, revelation, nourishment, insight, awareness, essential qualities to come back online. They're there. They're just bound, not available to us. So ego relaxation is really a more kind of feminine, holistic, compassionate approach to spiritual awakening and letting grace come alive.
Yeah. It sounds very graceful.
It is very graceful. When true surrender happens, it is very graceful. You're not doing anything.
No.
You're just relaxing. Ego doing that is what's normally happening, that we're often not even aware of. That's blocking the flow of grace unfolding itself, which is the natural condition and state.
Yeah. So it's life can be lived in that graceful way where there is not even really, you're not the doer.
That's it, right? We've never been the doer of anything ultimately, but it just hasn't seemed that way. So there is a process of seeing where, even though you might intellectually know you're not the doer, where you're still coming from that place. And of course, any place where you get caught in overwhelm, stress, anger, projection, any of the stuff that we all know so well. It's a separate somebody who thinks they're the doer and that they should figure it out or fix it. And they feel that they can't, hence the stress. And when we really look at who is that, we see that those are just the presumptions of a young child who was experiencing separation and thought the solution was some kind of trying harder. So that's really just what we need to keep being open to see, and when we see it, just to be there and sense and breathe and feel with love, with kindness, with compassion, and do nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually very simple. You could say
very simple. But of course, we all know simple doesn't mean easy. To actually practice this in a place where there's, deep suffering or a big kind of wave of anger, or where you really think you're right, or where you feel someone's really aggrieved you or done something to you, takes a great deal of spiritual commitment and courage to stop, stay in your body, breathe, sense, feel, open, and not pick up a defense.
Yeah.
That's a certain training. So a big part of what I'm really teaching people is how to actually practice that in all the moments of their life, because it's a practice for life.
Yes, it is. Seems like it's never ending.
Well, yeah, and until the surrender is spontaneous and natural, there's always an invitation to yield. And really, it shows us that whatever's going on in life, we really only have two choices: to let go or not to let go.
Okay.
Ultimately, that's it.
Let go. That sounds better if life, if you know yourself and you can live as whole instead of the separate self, then yeah, let go seems like a good plan.
Yeah, but I think then there's a lot of nuance to it because a lot of people here let go and they confuse that with collapse.
Okay.
And collapse into a heap or just be passive and not take responsive action is not surrender, is not letting go. That's another ego defense,
Hmm.
right? So sometimes the letting go requires that kind of musculature to know, stay in your body, breathe, go towards your fear, see what that really is. You know, open to whatever that anger might be, but don't act it out. Like, what is it really that's happening here? Who is it that feels that injury? Do they have an age? What is this really about? Right? So we have to not to take the let go or not to let go at the soundbite level, but really apply it to what's going on. And of course, that usually requires some study and some support. That's why I wrote that book and why I give a lot of teachings and practices so that we don't just take it at the soundbite level, but really work with it in the way we need to.
Yeah, so it becomes automatic. Like the
Yes.
surrender is just who you are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, and because sometimes also when you have pointers and you can get lost in them and you can get lost in practices, and then it's like the practice becomes the new religion or the path, and you miss the whole point, right? That can happen too.
I think when that happens, it's more that people are hooking on to a concept, but they're not actually kind of applying it really to what's going on. And so a big part of how I teach the practice of ego relaxation is through holistic inquiry. So I give a lot of different specific inquiries that relate to key things all human beings have to work through: fear, judgment, anger, control, mistrust, arrogance, humility, forgiveness, compassion, unwinding ego identity. Like, we need pointers to know where to look, and how to look and how to stay in those specific areas that are not easy for any of us. And ultimately, we also need to learn how to meet everything that arises with and from love, to relax the commentating mind and to really learn how to deepen in our direct experience. Again, there's a lot of talk about that, but most people I know, they don't quite know how.
Mm,
And as an Australian woman, I'm very rubber meets road. I'm interested in the how.
yeah, yeah, no, it's true because it can be difficult to know where do I start, or
Right.
and is there an end to it, and there's a lot of confusion.
A lot of confusion. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's a big part of why I've always oriented to running kind of ongoing sanghas, because I love to give 5-day retreats. It's one of my preferred formats. But at the same time, we need ongoing support of mighty companions who we form spiritual friendship with in order to see things and to discriminate the subtle misuse of spiritual teachings. And most of what I see comes out of, learning to relax out of the commentating mind that absorbs spiritual teachings and uses it as a way to kind of judge and beat up on yourself.
Mhm. Yeah.
And, I call that the knife of judgment.
Okay.
And we need to learn how to relax, drop that knife of judgment, whether it be about ourselves or anyone else.
Yeah. And I think it's just because we've grown up in a world where we are taught all that. And that's why it's so hard for us that to know who we are. I mean, it shouldn't be hard because we are already whole and we are already great. So it's just we focus our attention on something else that we learned, and ideas and objects, and so we overlook it, or we don't even recognize it.
Yeah, I think that's just part of the arc of being a human. I mean, I don't know a single human being that hasn't fallen from grace in those first few years of life. You know, Wordsworth, the poet, says, you know, we all come trailing clouds of glory, but we fall asleep. We lose touch with the love that we are, the freedom that is inherent, the peace that passeth all of understanding, the natural joy and clarity we all do. And the fact that everybody does and forms an ego structure that has all these layers to it that disconnect us from our fundamental, you know, wholeness and freedom, tells me that that's just, it's not wrong. It's just the first part of the human journey. And many people, you know, develop an ego structure and that's it. You know, they defend it for life. So it's really significant when someone starts to really kind of feel that impetus that says, I want to undo what isn't, which is really what spiritual awakening is about, is allowing the unraveling to happen of the me-go, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
To really kind of get intimate with what Ramana called the I, you know, the capital S self that doesn't have an owner or a label and isn't a man or a woman and doesn't belong to any particular country, right? Is ultimately nothing and no one.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a big process of deconstruction, you know, that has to happen. And many people aren't yet ready to allow the deconstruction. It's too scary. And so often what they need first is a lot of grounding and nurturing and encouragement and support and the building of trust, and those are really important foundations without which we can't allow the deeper surrenders of the spiritual path that brings us into intimate, direct contact with the naked purity and truth that we have always been. So I don't know, I just think it's a beautiful mystery, and really I keep coming back to, you know, what Ramana taught, which is, you know, be as you are. And to me what that means is both on the relative level as well as the absolute level, we have to start where we are. And that means not comparing ourselves to anybody else, not saying we should be somewhere else, that we should have a different kind of ego, that we shouldn't stumble on the things we stumble on, but to really accept, in a way, the deck of cards that is our life, in all of its kind of messiness and mystery, and regard the deck of cards of our life circumstance that includes the beautiful things and the challenging things, all of it that is here, as our curriculum, you know. And as we relate to it like that and take the bhavana, the attitude of the happy learner, then everything that is going on in our life can serve as fuel for the awakening that doesn't stop, continues.
Yeah. And life, as you live your life, it's like life will guide you, or, you know, it will serve everything for you that can awaken you.
And that's because the ground of existence is grace. And so the nature of grace is beneficence, is to bring you towards what will truly serve your evolution. It doesn't mean it's going to feel pleasant. But if you notice nature, if we just observe natural environments, we see that everything is sort of trying to harmonize itself and unfold itself in a harmonious way. that is beneficent ultimately, and that's the same power and presence that's living us and moving our lives. And so the more we recognize this, and the more we learn to see it and trust it, the more easily we can say yes rather than no
Yeah.
to what's happening, and let ourselves be moved in the direction and in the decisions that actually really serve.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So it's a lot about the surrender of.
It's all about surrender, really.
Yeah.
But surrender isn't a concept.
Right.
It's a continual yield
Mm.
to what always is, to what's true, to what's being asked in this moment, to what best serves. And of course, what gets challenged along the way of that is this little me and what I want and what I think and how I think it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we all have our version of that.
Yeah, because it's just so strong, you know.
It's very strong. Yeah. Yeah. And when we see it for what it is, we see, if you can see it through the eyes of forgiveness, right? That see beyond right, wrong, good, bad. They just see, inherent innocence. Like a child isn't intending to cause its parents problems. It's just being a child and trying stuff out, and let's try this, let's try that, let's experiment with that. It's innocent, even though it might be causing the parents a lot of stress. So in our ignorance, we are fundamentally innocent.
Yeah.
At the same time, we want to be growing up out of our ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
Learning to be less childlike spiritually, right?
Yeah.
And as we learn to recognize what has always been running the show is the power and the glory and the love and the intelligence, and it knows what it's doing, then we learn to align and yield to that pulse of the mystery that is unfolding, even in the midst of a relationship dynamic. What's the learning that's being asked here in that spot where you stumble in that painful way with your spouse or your family member? In that financial challenge to make your business work? In that moment where you feel really frustrated and you want to shoot off at somebody and act out in some way that isn't kind?
Yeah.
So when we get it that our life is the curriculum, and the master of the curriculum is the divine, the power, the love, grace, and that the nature of grace is evolution and beneficence, and to further its goodness, to let spiritual hydration deepen itself in this world through every single one of us in each moment.
Yeah.
And we learn, what is it that needs to relax here? What is my defense here? What needs to be seen?
Yeah.
What's at the core of that just needs to be met with love?
Wow. And it is here now, right? It's not like, oh, it's gonna be in 10 years. Or no, we are it here now. It's just
I think in this year, I know that's been huge for everyone all over the world. I think, the truth of living it, practicing it, not for some moment in the future, but for this moment. Because, we don't know what the next moment will be. We only have the now. And the peace the love, the joy, the fulfillment, the freedom is only now. It does not come through achieving some particular spiritual ideal. It's here now only. The question is, are you here now?
Right. Yeah. Oh. Well, I'm all hypnotized by you. I'm just like, wow. It's yeah. That's just so beautiful. I'm really grateful that we have had this conversation. So, what about your website and sessions and events, retreats? How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, I hope that if you've enjoyed this, you'll visit my website, and it is mirandamacpherson.com, mirandamacpherson.com. And on my website, there's a lot of resources for you. There's a lot of videos to watch. They're free. And there's a huge amount of downloadable audio meditations, audio teachings as well. And big part of what I've provided on my website is, is things that I really hope will practically help you. There are key meditations that help people with this work. So there's all of those meditations there. There's music as well. Most of the music that backs the meditations I've created. I'm also a mantra musician, so there's an album there, a new album coming. Yeah, so I hope people visit my website. And one of the things I love to do the most is these 5-day retreats. And so we have another retreat coming up fairly soon. I'll just have a quick look at the dates of that. The dates in the next retreat is the 19th through the 23rd of May. And these are virtual retreats that you can do from home. And I know a lot of people run virtual retreats, but the ones I offer are really dimensional. And so we limit the numbers to only 40 people so that I get to work with pretty much everybody in that 5-day period. And we do a lot of dyad work in pairs, as well as satsang and rich teaching and meditations and mantras. So, I welcome you to explore that. All the details are on my website.
Yeah, oh, great. And can I see your book again?
Oh, yeah.
I saw the cover. And
yeah. So there's an audio version of the book as well that contains me leading you through all the practices. But it's really like a workbook and a transmission. So if you like what I've said, I'm sure that you would really enjoy the book. It's published by Sounds True, so easily available and accessible.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and you also have a few other books as well.
Yes, my first book was called Boundless Love. That was published by Random House. And there's also an audio book called Meditations on Boundless Love, which is really the bridge between that book and The Way of Grace, and but oriented more to love and relationships.
Okay. Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much, Miranda. Really.
You're welcome. It's a joy to be here and spend this time with you and your community. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.